Hi, Michelle Glass here. Welcome back to another episode of our Chapter 5 lecture series, looking still at the integumentary system. We've already talked about the cutaneous membrane and the subcutaneous layer, and our job now is to look at the hair. Now, there are several diagrams that I'm using from your textbook, so if you have your textbook handy, you might want to pull out that artwork, or of course you can try drawing your own or just verbally describing it in your notes. So let's get started. Okay, hair is, of course, the part that we're seeing is non-living. It is located in a structure called a hair follicle, so we'll be looking at that as part of our study. And it has jobs of protection. So it's protecting the head and other parts of the body as well from ultraviolet radiation. It's providing cushion and some insulation of the skull. We also see it protecting in the nasal cavities and the ears and the eyes, as well as other parts of the body. Hair is important in sensory reception, so you're able to detect that tiny insect before it can really cause a lot of damage. Okay, so here is the first diagram that we'll look at from our textbook here. And we can see that the hair follicle is aligned by epidermis. So these structures are described as epidermal derivatives, meaning derived from epidermis, but extending way down into that dermal layer. Now, there are several structures associated with the hair and the hair follicle that we need to look at together. So at the base of each of our hair follicles, we have a root hair plexus, which is our sensory neurons. Remember, we're able to detect sensations from the hair, and so we're seeing that each hair at its base has this root hair plexus. We also have an associated muscle called the Erector Pili muscle, which when contracted will cause that hair to stick upright. So if you've had the goosebumps before and your hair is standing up on your arm or leg, it's because of the Erector Pili muscle. We see this in our pets a lot, in cats and dogs. Their hair sticks up on their back or puffs up. When they're maybe getting aggressive there. Notice too that the erector pili muscle is there beside the sebaceous gland. So we're going to talk about this again in the future, but actually when that muscle contracts, it's going to squeeze sebum out of that sebaceous gland into that hair follicle, helping to lubricate the hair shaft. Okay, so you have the hair root, which is the part that's anchored in the hair follicle, and then the part that you have sticking out above the cutaneous membrane is called the hair shaft. So when we talk about it's not living, there is of course a living component, but it's way down deep at the very base of the hair root. And then as we're getting further and further away from that base, we'll see of course that those cells are not alive. On the very outside of the hair follicle, you have that connective tissue sheath, which is helping to anchor the structure into that, the connective tissue of the dermis. Now we need to look at the layers of the hair follicle. We're going to be doing a cross section from the hair follicle and the hair. So what you can see is, of course, you've got that connective tissue sheath, and then on the very next layer you have a glassy membrane, which is the outermost. Then you have an external root sheath and an internal root sheath, which is right up there close to the hair itself. So I've drawn these concentric rings to show us our cross-section. You could just number in your paper if you don't want to draw those circles. And of course on the outside we have our connective tissue sheath, which is surrounding the follicle. Then you have a thin little layer called the glassy membrane, and our next full layer is the external root sheath, and then the internal root sheath, which is right up there close to the hair. So let's take a look back at the textbook artwork to see the layers of the hair. So the outermost layer of the hair is the cuticle, and then you have a cortex and then medulla. Now, cortex and medulla are terms that we're going to see throughout the course. Medulla is always talking about the innermost part of the organ or structure, and the cortex is always, surrounding that medulla. So the cuticle is, again, the outermost layer of the hair, and it's full of a really hard keratin. So if you have nice glossy hair, shiny hair, you have a nice intact cuticle, and it's that keratin protein, the same type of protein that we saw in the keratinocytes of the epidermis, giving that sort of glossy appearance. So just like we had keratinocytes in the epidermis, we have keratinocytes here forming the hair. The next layer is called the cortex. So remember, the cortex is going to surround the medulla, which is the innermost layer. Now the cortex also has keratin, but this is also the hard keratin. So this is making that hair stiff. When we look in the innermost core of the hair, that's the medulla, and it's containing a very soft keratin, which is giving the flexibility that we see with hair. At the very base, remember, of the hair, we need to have our living tissue. So we have what's called a hair bulb, which is going to surround both the hair papilla and the hair matrix. The hair papilla is going to contain your capillaries and your nerves. So here we're seeing the support of our living cells here at the very base. And then we have a little group of those living cells, which are called the hair matrix. So the hair matrix contains your stem cells or your germ cells, those cells that are mitotically active. And these are the cells that are going to do mitosis, cell division, to make new hair, which is going to be pushed out just like we saw in the epidermis. Because the hair matrix is full of these stem cells, you need to, of course, have adequate blood supply and innervation, and so that's the job of the hair papilla. And this whole section surrounding all of that is called the hair bulb. Your hair matrix is containing those melanocytes, which are the same cells that we saw in the epidermis. They are the cells producing melanin, which is the pigmentation to the hair. This can, of course, be influenced by genetics and hormones and the environment. And just like we saw with the epidermis, you have that collection of living cells, and then as the cells get pushed further and further and further away from the blood supply, you start to see that those cells are dying off. So some length of that hair root is going to see these dying and then dead cells, and of course all of the hair shaft is going to be composed of dead cells. And when we talk about the hair growth cycle, we're talking about an individual single hair in a follicle. And we do see that there's a lot of variation that happens here, and that variation is genetically and environmentally determined. So remember, we have those stem cells or basal cells there, the hair matrix dividing, doing mitosis to produce new hair cells. And this whole time that the hair matrix is active, we describe this as an active follicle, and this can last anywhere from 2 to 5 years that this hair is growing. Then we see that the follicle becomes inactive, meaning that we stop the division. Those hair matrix cells stop doing mitosis, and this hair becomes called a club hair. And soon that club hair is going to detach from the matrix so that it's no longer anchored in. And so when you comb your hair or take your shower and you get some hairs in your hand, those are those club hairs that have been detached, shedding. And then we're going to see that that follicle will reactivate, and that's especially when we're going to see that club hair being pushed out of that matrix. So when those club hairs when those basal cells go back into the division, then we see those club hairs have already been detached from the follicle, but now they're really going to be pushed out. There are 3 different types of hairs that we'll see in humans. The first is called the lanugo, and this is a fetal hair, so you don't typically see this one. It's usually shed before birth. And then we will see both vellus and terminal hairs on children, infants, children, adults. Vellus hairs are those kind of peach fuzz hairs that are covering the entire body. And then terminal hairs are the thicker, more darkly pigmented hairs that we see on the top of your head, your eyebrows, and your eyelashes. Now, as we go through puberty, of course, we know that there's changes with our hairs at that time. We talk about them as pubic hairs. So we can see that the vellus hairs can be converted to terminal hairs with the onset of those sex hormones, and that distribution is different. So we see, of course, in both sexes, the vellus hairs of the armpit and the groin area turning into terminal hairs. We see some thickening and darker pigmentation with arms and legs of both sexes, but then we see more often with males that dark pigmentation of the facial hair, chest hair, sometimes back hair, and then typically the arm and leg hair is overall more darkly pigmented and thicker on males than on females. Okay, and that's it for now. Stay tuned for more.